Call the meeting to order. Welcome to the West Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Agency Board of Directors meeting. Due to the ongoing COVID-19 crisis and pursuant to Executive Order N-2920, this special meeting is being held via conference call without physical meeting location. This special meeting was noticed in accordance with the Brown Act, in addition to a physical posting of the agenda at 333 East Canal Drive. The meeting was noticed on turlockgroundwater.org, social media, and emailed to the Subbasin's ongoing interested parties list. This meeting is being digitally recorded, and the board secretary has taken minutes as well. Materials presented are available online at turlockgroundwater.org. We encourage public participation during this meeting, much like an in-person GSA board meeting. We'll receive public comment during the public comment portion of the agenda early on, as well as receive comment on any specific agenda items. If you'd like to comment on matters not listed on the agenda, please click the raise your hand feature on Zoom and do so when I ask for public participation. If you're participating via phone, press the *9 to raise your hand over the phone. For those who would like to comment or ask a question on items listed on the agenda, please use the raise your hand feature during the presentation at that time. After board discussion, the host will unmute participants one by one to provide comment on that specific item. When time arrives to receive comment, staff will announce participants who have raised their hand and unmute participants one by one to provide comment. When their time comes in the queue, individual participants will need to unmute the device prior to speaking. Finally, towards the end of the agenda, we will adjourn to a closed session item. In order to adjourn to this closed session item, we will be utilizing a breakout room. The host will place the closed session participants into the room while the others remain in the main room. When the closed session concludes, a report of any action or no action will be given. With that, let's get the meeting started. Faye, can you call the roll, please?
Good evening, board. It's the meeting of August the 13th, and Director Alvarez.
Here.
Director Buck.
Here.
Director Espinoza.
Present.
Director Esquire.
Yes.
Director Klein. Director Klein. Director Maldonado.
Present.
Director Odom.
Here.
Secretary Chiesa.
Here.
Vice Chair Jurisma.
Here.
And Chair Alamo. Chair Alamo.
I am off of mute. Now I'm off mute. Okay, thank you, Faye. With that, I would entertain a motion for the approval of the regular meeting minutes of May 28th, 2020. Is there any corrections or changes? I would put those at the time too.
Move to approve.
Jurisma? Is that Director Jurisma?
Yep, that was me.
Thank you.
Second by Chiesa.
It's been properly moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion on the approval of the minutes? Hearing and seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Minutes pass. With that, we'll move on to agenda item D, public comment period. Interested persons in the audience are welcome to introduce any topic within the agency's jurisdiction. No action may be taken on any item not appearing on the posted agenda, except that the board may briefly respond to the comments, refer the matter to staff, or request it to be placed on a future agenda. Is there any public comment at this time?
Director Alamo, Chair Alamo, I'm looking here for raised hands. I'm not seeing any, and if there's anyone on the line that wishes to unmute and make a comment, it's available now.
Hearing none, we'll move on to agenda item E, staff updates. Joint TAC update, Lacey.
Good evening. This is Lacey McBride with Merced County, Vice Chair of the West Turlock GSA TAC. The joint TACs have been meeting every 2 weeks for the past couple of months. The TAC started holding special meetings in June, July, and August. These meetings are scheduled in between the regular monthly meetings, and these special meetings have been focused on GSP development in order to maintain the schedule and to prioritize some of the technical and more focused discussions on sustainable management criteria, undesirable results, and water budgets. The TAC members have had the ability to provide comments on the basin setting portion of the groundwater sustainability plan draft chapters and the modeling portion so far. Comments have been received, and our GSP consultant, Phyllis Stannon with Top Groundwater, is working on responses to these TAC comments, especially on the basin setting. I believe she already has some responses put together, and additionally, there are comments on the model, and they're anticipated to be addressed by Phyllis at a future meeting. The TAC has approved additional special meetings to continue the focused GSP development work for the months of September and October. There was a special meeting this afternoon as well. If additional meetings are needed, the TAC may approve those at a future meeting as well, just to keep the GSP development schedule on course. And this is a concise TAC update because the focus of these meetings has really been GSP development, and you will receive a report on the GSP update from Betty Liebersbach, who will discuss what's been happening in those meetings in an upcoming item. So that's all I have for the TAC update, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Lacey? Hearing none or not seeing any raised hands out there, we will move on to the interbasin coordination.
Great. This is Lacey again, and this is going to be a quick update for you. The Turlock Basin has not held any interbasin coordination meetings over the past 3 months. However, that doesn't mean that coordination isn't continuing, and it is through the development of our water budgets, especially between the Modesto and the Turlock subbasins, by our consultant, Todd Groundwater. As you know, Todd Groundwater is working on developing GSPs in both the Turlock and Modesto Basin. And so Phyllis Stannon and the technical team has been working on the modeling in the Modesto subbasin and coordinating the models between Turlock and Modesto and the water budgets to make sure the two basins align and are coordinated between those two. So while we haven't had specific GSA interbasin meetings, we do know that on a technical side, there is coordination going on, especially between Turlock and Modesto. We have not had any meetings with Delta Mendota or Merced in the past few months, but I anticipate that in the future we will continue to have coordination meetings with them as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions on the interbasin coordination.
Questions for Lacey? Pretty quick update. Okay, let's move on to GSP update. Lacey or Debbie, who's taking this one?
Good evening. This is Debbie Liebersbach. I have a presentation to kind of walk through some concepts with you and update you on what we've been doing. So if you could move to the next slide, Herb, thank you. So really what we've been doing is working on a multifaceted approach to this process. So there's lots of moving parts, but I wanted to kind of introduce you to some of the items that we're working on at this time. And as we move forward, all of these will kind of coalesce into the GSP, but they're all required. We're working on sustainable management criteria. We're also looking at potential groundwater dependent ecosystems and evaluating those and figuring out what we might be needing to do with respect to those. As Lacey indicated, we're also working on modeling, and so I'll give you an update on that. And we've also started evaluating the monitoring network and what we might need in the future. And so I wanted to touch on each of those items. So if you could move to the next slide, Herb. Thank you. Sustainable management criteria. Next slide. As you've seen before, Sigma requires that we evaluate 6 sustainability indicators. And so we are in the process of looking at all 6 of those indicators. We've kind of made some recommendations that we'll be bringing back to the GSAs for concurrence as we bring the other indicators and information back to the GSA, this seawater intrusion indicator is likely not something that is pertinent to our subbasin. It's more related to seawater intrusion on, say, a coastal basin where there is actual seawater up adjacent to the coast that could be intruding into and coming into the groundwater system below those subbasins. So next slide. So we are required to analyze each of the sustainability indicators as it's relevant to the Turlock Subbasin, and then define what undesirable results are, which are essentially conditions we need to avoid. Undesirable results are characterized as significant and unreasonable occurrences of any of the individual sustainability indicators. And so what we're required to do is essentially to document in the GSP what is considered significant and unreasonable in a more qualitative way. And then those general descriptions are later translated into quantitative undesirable results. And those specific undesirable results result in a minimum threshold for that indicator. And then we're also required to assign measurable objectives for that indicator. So that's kind of the target for what you're looking for in 20 years to achieve. So by the 2042 deadline of needing to be sustainable, that's kind of what we're looking to achieve. We'll also have to identify interim milestones that kind of show progress towards that goal. And we'll have to develop a monitoring program to measure progress towards achieving those goals. The next slide. So this is a diagram that was developed by DWR to help illustrate some of these concepts. And I always found it very helpful because it reminds you of how it all fits together. This is a representative diagram of the groundwater level indicator, sustainability indicator. And so this is a representative of a hydrograph that you could have for a well that shows groundwater levels behind a minimum threshold as that orange line, and then anything in the pink zone underneath that minimum threshold is considered an undesirable result. And so you can see that the blue line kind of shows groundwater levels going up and down over time, and it actually shows that the minimum threshold is exceeded at some point after 2022, after the GSP is adopted, but then it kind of moves up and moves towards the measurable objective by 2042. And that's kind of the goal, is to kind of get to the measurable objective by 2042. But it's okay to exceed that minimum threshold and have undesirable results in the meantime, because they recognize that there's actions and things that have to happen between when you adopt the plan in 2022 and 20 years later, when you're supposed to be at a point where you've achieved sustainability in 2042. It doesn't mean that you have to exceed the minimum threshold, but it says that you can. The other thing that that is important is that so for example, this chronic lowering of water level sustainability indicator, you'll have multiple wells throughout the basin that will be evaluated, and so the undesirable results could be a combination of exceedances that would be undesirable. It doesn't necessarily have to be one well exceeding the minimum threshold that would be an undesirable result. It could be multiple wells under a series of years that could be an undesirable result. So there's lots of nuances, and it's complicated. And so it's taking some time, and we're really kind of diving in and discussing this and trying to understand what it means for our subbasin. Next slide, please. So this gives an example of what happened in another subbasin. So this is a current subbasin, and it's an example of one of their wells and the sustainable management criteria and how they're kind of looked at it. It shows something similar to the previous diagram, where you have groundwater levels in blue that have fluctuated over time, and it shows water levels from 95 through 2017. And it was higher, and then it went down, and then it went higher, and then it went down, and so forth. And then there's a lower part. And so they set their minimum threshold at their historic low level, which is an option and something, you know, some basins have done. Other basins have chosen something different. You can see that their measurable objective is kind of at that midpoint between the high water levels historically in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the low water levels. And so that's what their objective is and what they're trying to manage too. And they considered that difference between the two as their operational range. And so it kind of gives you some ideas on how it all kind of fits together. Next slide, please. So this is another example, and I wanted to kind of just provide this one so you could kind of see how each of the sustainability indicators then have, this is developed for the Merced Subbasin, then has a minimum threshold established for it, measurable objective, and then an undesirable result that's all defined for each of these sustainability indicators individually. So for, again, the groundwater level example, the depth, they defined their minimum threshold as being the depth of the shallowest well in a 2-mile radius of each representative well, because there's a monitoring network within the subbasin, right? Or if there isn't there isn't data showing a shallow well within the 2-mile radius, then they establish the minimum threshold as the minimum pre-January 1st, 2015 level, as the minimum threshold for that individual well. And so you would establish that for each of the wells within the subbasin. The measurable objective for the Merced Subbasin was the projected average future groundwater level under sustainable yield modeling simulation. So they use their model to evaluate the water levels into the future. And so they're using that as their measurable objective. And we're planning on using a model as well to kind of project what water levels would be under future scenarios. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then we have the undesirable result. And in their particular case, they said that an undesirable result would be anything greater than 25% of the representative wells falling below the minimum threshold for 2 consecutive wet, above normal, or below normal years. So it kind of gives you an idea of how other subbasins have looked at this. And there's a variety of examples out there. I have to caution that DWR has cautioned us that although we can look at what other subbasins have done, we really need to consider what is appropriate for us. And so we're approaching it that way. We're aware of what some of the other GSPs have developed and what they propose, but we haven't seen how DWR has judged them as far as their effectiveness and whether they comply with the SGMA requirements or not. And so there might need to be changes in other subbasins to address issues if DWR has identified those. And so we're cautiously looking at other examples, but it helps to kind of, I think, illustrate what could be done perhaps and lets us look at what really is appropriate for our subbasin. Next slide, please. That's all I had on the sustainability criteria. I know there's a lot to all of that, and it's really interesting how it all fits together, and it's something that we'll be talking about again. But I wanted to kind of touch on those items again to kind of give you an idea of what we've been talking through. I did also want to let you know that in the process of talking through all of it, we've been developing some draft memorandums to as a means of documenting the discussions and putting down in paper kind of the concepts as we continue to craft what we think the initial sustainable management criteria might be. But the information contained in the memos, once they're finalized, will be used to craft the language and information within the GSP. So I think that information will be helpful. But I wanted to remind you that this is also going to be an iterative process. It's these initial sustainable management criteria that we're developing are a starting point, and then we'll use modeling to understand it more and understand where we might need to make adjustments and what have you to kind of pull everything together. So it's going to be an iterative process. So keep it in mind as we bring some of these draft items to you in the future. Okay, so next slide, please. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is groundwater dependent ecosystems. These are ecological communities and species that depend on groundwater that is emerging from aquifers at or near the ground surface. The GSP requires that we look at those using available data from either the Department of Water Resources or other best available sources. When we first embarked down this process of developing a GSP, there wasn't a lot of information out there. And since that time, DWR has worked in coordination with the Nature Conservancy to develop what they call a natural communities commonly associated with groundwater mapping system, where they did an initial screening of potential areas of vegetation or potential wetlands that might possibly be groundwater dependent ecosystems. And so they used imagery and other things to kind of do this screening. And as a result, there's this mapping system that we need to be able to look at and evaluate. And that mapping system includes about 2,500 polygons of vegetation or potential wetlands within the Turlock Subbasin. And as we scoped the GSP development, we didn't have an idea that this would be available and this process would be needed. And so there really wasn't an approach or funding to analyze those maps at, initially. And so we've been developing that. So next slide, please. This gives you an idea of the locations of some of these polygons. They really do need some ground truthing. They may or may not be groundwater dependent ecosystems. And since under the GSP, groundwater dependent ecosystems are considered users of water. And so we need to consider all users of water as we develop the GSP. And so it's important to know if these are potential groundwater dependent ecosystems or not. And so that's why we're kind of embarking on this process. Next slide, please. So this gives you an idea of, this is an aerial view of a portion of the subbasin near Turlock Lake, and it kind of shows you where some of these polygons are. And so the question is are they truly groundwater dependent ecosystems, or are they potential internal drainages? What's the depth of water there? Are they reliant on irrigation or river water? You can see a lot of the polygons are right adjacent to the Tuolumne River. Some of the polygons elsewhere in the basin could be perhaps recharge basins or water treatment plant, retention ponds, or perhaps even lagoons for dairies, and so it's really important to kind of walk through and look at and screen, if we think that they are polygons that could potentially be groundwater dependent ecosystems. Next slide, please. So where we've been going with this is Karen Morgan, who works for the city of Ceres, is in the process of pursuing her master's degree with Oregon State University. And she has an interest in this process and has volunteered to work with Todd Groundwater to begin to kind of screen some of these polygons for possible scenarios where it really doesn't make sense that they could be a groundwater dependent ecosystem, that they have another source of water, or there's something else going on. And so she's working directly with Todd Groundwater to kind of work through this, and then she's going to be bringing it back to the technical advisory committee, and then the technical advisory committee will bring it back to this board. But that's the process that we're going through, and we're really grateful that Karen has an interest in this and is willing to take on this initial screening task. It might very well be that once she goes through the initial screening task, that some of the individual agencies might need to take a look at that and look at some of the remaining polygons to see if there's something else or other information that might be available to further screen it. But this is going to be an initial tool, and we're very grateful for her efforts in that process. Next slide, please. Sorry, lots of information. Groundwater modeling. I wanted to talk a little bit about this. So next slide, please. So as you heard back in February, Phyllis Stannon with Todd Groundwater gave a presentation on the historic water budget analysis that had been developed for our subbasin. And since that time, as Lacey was indicating, the Modesto subbasin's groundwater model, which is being done by the same consultant team, was also finished and calibrated, and it resulted in some minor changes to the historic water budget. And that historic water budget is being used to kind of analyze past water supplies and groundwater conditions, and to gain confidence in the model's ability to represent the subbasin and how it works. The consultant team is in the process of obtaining input from the TAC on those changes since their completion of the model north of the Tuolumne River. And once that's complete, then we can move on to step 2. And step 2 is to use a model to project 50 years into the future and to analyze what those future conditions might be, both pre-Sigma, so in other words, projecting into the future in a baseline scenario to look at what the future conditions would be without any implementation of the GSP. So, so that'll be the first modeling scenario. And then after that, we'll layer on projects and management actions and climate change into the projection into the future to kind of evaluate how we achieve sustainability and to demonstrate that it's achievable. And so the modeling tool will be very helpful, but it's important to go through this process of vetting how the historic modeling scenarios have gone and to get confidence in the model in that way. Next slide, please. We'll also be using the model to evaluate sustainable yield. Many of you may have heard of sustainable yield when talking about groundwater elsewhere. I think sustainable yield is defined slightly differently under Sigma terms. Under Sigma terms, sustainable yield is the amount of groundwater that can be withdrawn annually without causing undesirable results. So it's really connected to the sustainable management criteria that we was talking about earlier. It'll be a part of the estimated water budget that's included in the GSP and the outcome of avoiding the undesirable results. So we'll be using the model to analyze this as well. And so I think that's also an important component. Next slide, please. So lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about groundwater monitoring. In addition to all of the other things that we're working on, we're starting to look at the existing monitoring program and what might be needed in the future. So the next slide. And I'm almost done, I promise. So we started to take a look at the existing monitoring network as a starting point. The existing monitoring network, it has a long history of data, and so that's very useful as you move forward because you understand kind of what the conditions have been. Eastside has already started adding to their monitoring network because they did have a significant data gap further to the east. And so that is ongoing. We've also have some new wells that will be installed in the coming years. The Proposition 68 grant provides funds for additional wells. There's 3 wells that will be installed on the East Turlock Subbasin GSA, and 2 multi-completion wells will be installed in the West Turlock Subbasin GSA. Multi-completion wells are wells that will monitor both the upper aquifer and the lower aquifer within the same site. And that is really helpful as we move forward with the GSP, because the GSP will require that we do that. And many of the monitoring wells within the western portion of the subbasin only monitor either the upper or the lower aquifer. And so those 2 wells will be helpful. There may actually be more that will need to be installed over time, although I do think some of the urban agencies have some in place already, and we will try to make use of all of the facilities that are available to us as we move forward. The East Turlock Subbasin GSA has also requested DWR's assistance in drilling some additional wells, and that might be a resource for us as well in the future as we move forward. There's also likely going to be a need for some wells along the river boundaries to evaluate surface water and groundwater interaction. So I wanted to make you aware of that as well. And so that's really all I had for you today, I think. I think that's the last slide. I could be wrong. I had a typo in the title. Sorry about that. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if you might have them.
Any questions for Debbie? Any hands raised out there, Herb?
I'm not seeing any, Chair Alamo.
Well, thank you for that update, Debbie.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Herb, with the public outreach update.
Okay, sit tight. I have a couple quick slides I will pull up. So this is the public outreach update since you last met in May. Since then, we've held two virtual community workshops on July 8th, and one was at 11 and one was at 5 p.m. 35 participants. It's still available right now on our YouTube channel at Turlock Groundwater, and we streamed it live as well on YouTube. We covered that. You see a list of the topics we covered. Was mainly procedural and talking about some common questions. And then we covered some technical tools as well. Summary notes are finalized and are available on our website of the workshop. And we are planning another virtual workshop right now, potentially for the first couple weeks of September. You see a screenshot there of the one of the workshops. We did some Facebook advertising. We spent almost $60, and it ended up getting a reach of 8,200 people. We targeted people within the Turlock Subbasin, and it's kind of the first time we've really done that and put some money toward Facebook advertising. And we got, well, we had a similar amount of people that traditionally attend TAC meetings and GSA board meetings. We did get a different group of people, which was nice. There was some names there of people that we don't normally see at meetings, and so that was a good sign. We launched a stakeholder assessment survey 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's a brief survey, kind of tagging on the heels of the Modesto Subbasin, which has a much more detailed survey that they've had out for probably a little over a year now, to get some stakeholder information. It's 13 questions. Actually, we've had more than, I have 7 responses already from a previous presentation, 18 responses. It's around 18, unless somebody signed up earlier today. Thus far, 18 stakeholders have responded, and we'll take a look at the information they presented about their concerns and their thoughts moving forward on that. And so you see a link there, which is also available on the turlockgroundwater.org website as well. So that survey continues to be open. We don't have a plan on when to close it, but we're just going to use it to intake some information from stakeholders. turlockgroundwater.org continues to be one of our major outreach tools. Just side note, there was a small outage on July 17th due to a small issue that's been resolved. We have our video up now on the homepage, our 5-minute Sigma promotional video, which you saw about a year ago when it came out. And we're promoting our stakeholder assessment, and we have a continued pop-up as new users go to the site, asking them to join our interested parties email list. This just since you last met on May 28th. These are the public meetings that have been held. I mentioned the 2 virtual community workshops, and then there's been those 5 meetings, the most recent of which was this afternoon's special meeting of the technical advisory committees. And there's a screenshot there of one of the shots from the meetings, which you actually just saw from Ms. Liebersbach. So there's that. We continue to send emails out to interested parties. There's a sample email there pictured. We started doing this back in the early part of last year. We've sent about 51 emails thus far, roughly around 2.5 emails a month to our almost 300 subscribers at current that get that. Just a reminder, we have bill inserts and fact sheets that we've created for agencies to share regarding Sigma information and engagement in the process. And then I mentioned it already, but there's the Sigma in the Turlock Subbasin video that's informational that we have up on our website as well, and up on the Turlock Groundwater YouTube page. A few quick other efforts. We're working with the Modesto Subbasin to coordinate some virtual office hours sometime this summer and fall. And so those will be more informal discussions, kind of open-ended discussions instead of the traditional workshops that we've held. And so we're working on those. And then we're working on it's the massive effort. It's not quite as big as other things in the groundwater sustainability plan, but we're working to compile all the outreach efforts that we've done for the various sections in the GSP that outline how we've communicated to stakeholders, what we've communicated, how comments were addressed, all these things. We're starting to compile all those so that we can provide those in the GSP to the Todd team as we work those in there. So those are some of our other efforts we're doing. And that is the end of my presentation, and I am happy to take any questions or comments at this time.
Hey, can we go back one step? We had a question for Debbie. Debbie, you still on the line? David had a question for you. Can you unmute him, please?
Let's see here. I'm working on that now. He should be able to self-unmute. Nobody's muted on our end. If they want to unmute on their end, they should be free to speak.
Okay, Herb. Thank you. I'm not sure if Debbie is still on, but the question was, as far as our subbasin, when it comes to the measurable objective, were we looking at the bottom line for our undesirable result to be the lowest recorded well levels, or are we looking at somewhere in the middle, like that little slideshow showed, like the kind of in the middle of the highest and the lowest?
Thank you for the question. We're talking about it. We haven't developed what the recommended initial minimum threshold might be. There's different thoughts on it. And it also recognized that all of these minimum thresholds interact amongst themselves. So, for example, are not minimum threshold, all of the sustainability indicators kind of act together to, to provide the view of what sustainability should be. And so it may be that some indicators might take prominence when working through this, so that water levels might be controlling. And if you manage water levels in a certain way, then it might address groundwater storage and water quality, perhaps also. And it might be what they call a proxy for that as you move forward. Or you could have all of these things individually addressed through monitoring programs and what have you. So we don't have all the answers yet. But getting back to your question, we've talked about using the minimum threshold as the low levels that we've observed over time. But then others have concerns with respect to when those low levels have occurred, what types of things have occurred at that time as well. And so we haven't coalesced yet on a recommendation, but all of those things are in part of the discussion.
Debbie, this is Valerie Kincaid. If I can, that's a great explanation. If I could just add one kind of process-oriented part to that. That Debbie mentioned kind of at the end there, and I don't know if the board picked up on it, but that the TAC is going to work with the consultant and come up with recommendations. And then those recommendations will go to this board. So this board this board will actually be making those decisions and setting those upon, of course, the recommendations that are informed by representatives at the TAC. And one of the things that Debbie was talking about, the struggle here and the overall, I don't know if it's a tension, but the overall difficulty in Sigma is that, remember, these GSAs are regulatory agencies. So the minimum thresholds, you want to set them at a point that will be sustainable for the basin, but also achievable by the GSA. You don't want to set yourself up to fail. You also don't want to set yourself up to, drive the groundwater basin into overdraft. So those two tensions really do come into play. And as Debbie said, I think the TAC is already, feeding in the technical information and struggling with those. But procedurally, those will be recommendations that come to the board.
Thank you, Valerie.
Any questions for Herb on the public outreach update now? Hearing none, let's move on to the budget update. Michael.
Good evening, everyone. For the month of July, the West Turlock GSA, we had minimal activity. We started the month with $111,071.80. We cut one check for $2,990, and we ended the month with $108,081.80. Any questions on the West Turlock GSA account? Moving on to the Basin account. This is where we have funds with the East Turlock group as well. So we started the month with $833,036.85. We received one reimbursement from DWR for grant work for $37,806.12. And we ended the month at the end of July with $870,842.97. Any questions?
Questions for Michael? Thank you, Michael. We'll move on to agenda item F. Number 1, TAC interim leadership. Michael.
Good evening, Chair Alamo, members of the board. Every 2 years, you appoint some of your staff to act in leadership roles with your technical advisory committee. And last summer, I notified you that I would not be able to fulfill my obligations as the chair due to my increased job responsibilities. Fortunately, in that meantime, Lacey McBride of Merced County has been fulfilling my role as the TAC chair and done an outstanding job. And I'm very grateful to her for what she's done for the GSA in that period of time. But unfortunately, this fall, Lacey will be taking a leave of absence from her position with Merced County and won't be able to perform her role with the Technical Advisory Committee. On the other hand, I've changed jobs in the meantime, and I'm now able to devote my time back to my responsibilities in the chair position for the Technical Advisory Committee. But we do recommend, however, that an interim vice chair be appointed by the board to help me and the rest of the TAC in fulfilling our obligations to you and in the development of our sustainability plan. And fortunately, Karen Morgan of the City of Ceres has volunteered to help out as the interim vice chair. She brings great knowledge to the position and experience, and as well as the perspective of a municipal water agency. It's always been kind of our goal to make sure that both the municipal and the ag interests are equally represented through these leadership positions. So our recommended action is for the board to appoint Karen Morgan from the City of Ceres to the position of interim vice chair for the Technical Advisory Committee. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I'll be willing to entertain that motion, that action, or any questions for Michael.
This is Gil. I would move to appoint Karen as the interim vice chair.
I'll second that. This is Curtis.
It has been properly moved and seconded to appoint Karen Morgan as interim vice chair. Is there any further discussion on this matter?
I just want to say I think Karen's extremely qualified to do this role. She brings a whole bunch of knowledge to the position, and I think she'll be fantastic in that role.
Any other discussion or comments? Seeing none, I'll call a vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed, same sign. Congratulations, Karen. You are now interim vice chair. Moving on, agenda item F2, Todd Groundwater Agreement Amendment.
And Chair Alamo, this is Michael. I'm going to take that item again. Herb, do you have the PowerPoint? There we go. Again, good evening, Chair Alamo and a member of the board. We have before you is a recommended amendment to the agreement with Todd Groundwater to have them subcontract with a company called Environmental Science Associates to prepare a draft program environmental impact reports. And we're going to go through that right now. So next slide. So what is a programmatic environmental impact report? It's a document put together under the California Environmental Quality Act to look at the comprehensively analyze the basin-wide environmental impacts of the activities and projects and programs we anticipate promulgating through the sustainability plan. So that'll be known as the program, the activities we undertake to implement the GSP. Those activities are subject to the California Environmental Quality Act. And we will recommend developing the environmental impact report as we develop the sustainability plan, so they inform each other and provide a comprehensive approach to allow us to implement the sustainability plan. The good thing with a programmatic environmental impact report, it does allow an agency to expedite implementation of their program. So future projects that are contained in the GSP will only be analyzed for site-specific impacts that weren't previously addressed in the EIR. And for those who worked for cities and counties, it's like a general plan, and you have your general plan EIR, so it allows you to expedite some of the activities in that plan. Next slide. Okay, so the EIR is funded under round 3 of Proposition 68. We've set aside, or you've set aside, $395,000 for this work. The goal is to start work in September, to be completed in September 2022 and start work in October of this year. So it's about a 2-year process. The final, so this is what we call a draft public and programmatic environmental impact report. So that's the thick document that gets released to the public. At that point, you get responses from the public, as well as responsible and trustee agencies, non-governmental organizations, and other interested parties can make comments. At that point, your consultant works on looking at those comments, addressing those comments, making revisions to the environmental impact report, and then publishes what's called the final environmental impact report. The work to be undertaken for the final environmental impact report will be funded by the GSA. So that's not included in the $395,000 of Prop 68 funding. So we will have to fund that final EIR that lasts a little bit of work. through contributions through GSA members. Okay, next slide. So the company we're looking to hire is Environmental Science Associates. I put ESA there. It's not the Endangered Species Act, so don't get those confused. It's Environmental Science Associates. They've worked with Turlock Irrigation District in the past on local project environmental impacts and analysis. They've also worked with Todd Groundwater in the past on groundwater management and planning documents. They have experience in doing these type of programmatic EIRs. And we actually use them as we put our grant application together to demonstrate someone who would have expertise to do this type of work, although the grant conditions do allow us to hire anybody for this work. So just because ESA helped us put our grant application together, the board is not obligated to hire them. Next slide, please. So there's two options to hire a company to do this type of professional services work based on the procurement procedures you adopted at your last board meeting. The first option is to go through a more formal request for proposal process, or RFP. And some of you are familiar with that. The advantage of that approach is what you would do is look at 3 consultants at least, ask them to participate in a competitive process. They would submit proposals to show you how they would conduct the work. You have a subcommittee of the Technical Advisory Committee review those proposals, do interviews, and make recommendations based on a number of scoring criteria that you develop. The disadvantage with this approach, on the other hand, is that sometimes it's difficult to get everyone together to put together the RFP, go through the evaluation process and presentations. Particularly as during this period of the pandemic, sometimes our work efficiency goes down a little bit. Timeline for going through the RFP process is probably 2 to 3 months, or 8 to 12 weeks. By the time we write the RFP, put it out for at least 30 days to get people to respond, review those responses, conduct interviews, analyze the results, and then bring it to the board. We're looking at least 2 to 3 months. One of the other challenges we're seeing in the industry right now is that we might not get many bidders or responders to the RFP because ESA has already been involved a little bit with Todd and TID, and also in putting our grant application together. Sometimes consultant teams or consultants are reluctant to try their luck in a new area, knowing the existing relationships exist, even though obviously we review everything objectively, but sometimes that discourages people from even going through the effort of responding to an RFP. Next slide. Okay, the second option you have under your procurement policies is to just award the agreement directly to ESA as a professional services contract. So again, at your last meeting, you adopted the purchasing procedures that Turlock Irrigation District has, with the caveat that any contract larger than $250,000 has to be awarded by the board. So that's what we're talking about tonight. Again, this consultant has good prior experience and helped us in the past, and they're very familiar with work in this area, so there'd be no learning curve. We could negotiate an agreement quickly, or your general counsel would, to get them on board sooner rather than later. And then, again, as I mentioned before, we're not sure of how many other consultants may even or submit proposals to do this work. The disadvantage, obviously, is this is a non-competitive process. You're handing work directly to a professional consultant and doesn't allow others to participate. But again, sometimes going through the process and the bidding process, you often don't save that much money, but you do spend a lot of time. Next slide, please. So we took this item to the Technical Advisory Committee in July 23rd, 2020 of this year. And their recommendation was to go with option 2. They looked at the pros and cons of both options and agreed the best approach would be to have this board award Environmental Science Associates with a professional services agreement to do the programmatic environmental impact report. And I think that's it. Is there another slide? Questions? There you go. I'm happy to answer any questions at the time, and obviously your general counsel, Ms. Kincaid, is on the line, and she can pitch in where needed. So if you do award this contract tonight, Ms. Kincaid will put together an agreement. The terms will be negotiated, and the board chair could then sign that agreement. Again, any questions for me?
Any questions for Michael?
Move to approve using option 2 or option B, whichever the letter was, to award this as a professional service.
Thank you, Curtis. Is there a second to that?
I'll second that. Gil.
Thank you, Gil. Been moved and second. Is there any further discussions or questions regarding using option 2, awarding this contract? Hearing no further questions or comments, I'll have Faye read the vote, being this be a resolution.
For the resolution 2020-04 for the Todd groundwater amendment with ESA is Director Odom,
Yes.
Director Maldonado,
Yes.
Director Esquire,
Yes.
Director Espinoza,
Yes.
Director Buck,
Yes.
Director Alvarez,
Yes.
Secretary Chiesa,
Yes.
Vice Chair Jurisma,
Yes.
and Chair Alamo.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments from the board? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn to closed session. We have one matter to discuss: conference with legal counsel, anticipated litigation.
Gil moves to adjourn to closed session.
I'll second.
Curtis had the second. Gil, is there any further discussion on adjourning to closed session? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed, same sign? Okay, hang tight, and we'll go to a breakout room for a closed session.